Hi, everybody. I'm going to introduce our topic for the day. We're going to be talking about self-care. We're going to be talking about that with a very important key underlying issue to self-care, which is self-esteem. So I'm Ellen, and I'm a licensed master social worker and a coach, certified coach, as well as a minister. I've done a lot of my work around education and coaching, so that end of the spectrum. And with me today is Jenny, and I'll have her introduce herself.
Hi, hello, I'm Jenny Florence. I now write, but I have my background is in 26 years of working as a psychotherapist. So self-esteem and self-care are very, very big on my agenda. I've sort of wound out of a long private practice and now simply write and speak. One of the subjects that I really home in on is self-esteem and also emotional health and well-being. I'm the founder of the A to Z of Emotional Health online audio library, which is a resource dedicated to supporting all aspects of emotional health.
Excellent, excellent. So I know one of the things that is important for people to think about is just an overarching question, which is, what is self-care to you? And I think that we get off on the wrong foot immediately by not even just defining that. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite an ambiguous term, interestingly enough, because what one person's idea of self-care is may actually be different to another. I think for some people it can be loaded with a great deal of optimism and really positive kind of attributes. Other people have quite a negative approach to it. They can see self-care as being selfish. So I think it tends to be, as I said, we have very personal perceptions of what that means. And I think it is very, very valuable to define it. To my mind, if we are engaged in healthy self-care, it means we are living our lives from a position of self-responsibility. We recognize that we have needs. We recognize that those needs are healthy. That's not a selfish thing. It doesn't mean we're going to live in a way that disregards others. But it also means we recognize, if we are a glass half full, if we are looking after ourselves, if we use that analogy, when we look after ourselves, we have far more to give to others. So for me, there's something very, very important about establishing that it's not a selfish approach, but it doesn't mean that we are disregarding others either. And we are really embracing a position of self-responsibility in terms of recognizing our own needs at any given time.
Yeah, I love that terminology, self-responsibility. We talk about self-compassion and self-love, and then the self-responsibility is, I think, another piece of that has kind of a different component to it. But and what you're talking about comes right into self-esteem, and I talk about self-care as selfish as a myth. Right, as one of the myths of self-care. And I think that comes directly back into self-esteem, right? So when we think about how other people see us, if I'm taking care of myself, do people think I'm not working hard enough? Am I not giving enough of myself? What do people see in me when I take care of myself? So that piece ties into self-esteem. And I think the other piece too is then what do I see when I start to take care of myself? So that fear component of what other people see if you're taking care of yourself, and then what you're going to find, right? So when people get quiet and they start to ask that question, what do I need, like you're referring to, that can be terrifying. Because then you start to see things that maybe you tried to not see, and then you have to answer those questions, and so then you have that responsibility to yourself.
I agree completely. I think it's a real challenge actually for us to sometimes have a very real evaluation of what's going on in our lives and say, right, okay, this bit isn't working for me, so I need to step up and do something about that, or, you know, as well as just the bits in life that are working for us. It's interesting as you were talking, because I think self-esteem is absolutely crucial to our ability to be responsible for ourselves and to be involved in self-care. Because if we generally don't feel particularly strong, or if we're not going to give ourselves permission to look after ourselves, then, as I said, self-esteem is so important, because if we have low self-esteem, we're generally full of self-doubt. And it's curious because sometimes we can imagine that people will look upon us badly or think that we're being selfish. They may not actually feel that way at all.
Sure.
But actually, if we've got low self-esteem, we're more likely to have an expectation that people might judge us badly. And interestingly enough, that's actually probably a mirror of how we actually relate to ourselves.
Right. So if I'm not, you know, if I take the time to take care of myself, I'm not being as good of a worker as I could be, or I have to prove myself first before I can allow myself to take care of myself, right? Before I deserve it, or I couldn't possibly be as good a parent as I should be if I take the time to take care of myself. So all of those judgments, right, that come up.
What I think you've just highlighted and really beautifully in your language is the internal dialogue that we have within ourselves. And, you know, sometimes our dialogue is, you know, hopefully in an ideal world, our dialogue is really supportive. It's kind, it's compassionate. We're kind of really cool with ourselves if we make a mistake. I mean, a mistake, as far as I'm concerned, it's like the cutting edge of our evolution. It's the place we learn the most. But actually, for a lot of us, we're not very kind to ourselves. You know, that internal dialogue is ultra critical.
Right.
You know, I think sometimes people have, I mean, I wouldn't even call it an inner critique, it's an inner bully. You know, sometimes people are relentlessly horrible to themselves. They set themselves continual unrealistic goals, unrealistic targets. And even if they're achieved brilliantly, they never, ever actually reward themselves or stop and say, wow, I did brilliantly. They're always on to the next one. It's as though they'll never, ever be quite good enough. And I love the phrase good enough. It's a phrase I use a lot with people that I work with. It's because actually being good enough is about being healthy. You know, we're not perfect. We can't get everything right. That's just not the way that we are. We're not designed that way. I mean, as I said, I think we learn through our mistakes. I think it's really interesting that, you know, if we think about children, you know, when they start to talk, they don't suddenly speak fluently. You know, they don't suddenly, you know, burst into sort of eloquent conversation. You know, we're longing for their first words, and we love them that they are not.
Well, my son is 2, and he just started talking in the last month. So you're speaking my language right now.
But isn't it beautiful that we love that? And when they start to toddle, they pull themselves up on the furniture and then they topple over and we pick them up, and we're so encouraging. You know, we don't sit there and say, oh, you're so stupid, you didn't say that right. You know, we're longing for it. We love watching them evolve.
The process of learning.
The process of that. And I think, at what point does that change? You know, at what point do we stop treating our learning curve, our natural evolution, as something to be cherished and enjoyed and loved and laughed about? At what point does that shift and it becomes a kind of an onslaught with sometimes an internal bully? And I love using that analogy, because I kind of think actually the way to really shift this within ourselves, and it's quite a massive component, I think, in self-care, in active self-care, is to shift that internal approach to ourselves to one of laughter, of loving our mistakes, of cherishing the fact that we had a go anyway, and how amazing, and actually if that didn't go so well, fantastic, we can learn from this. It's like going back and saying, right, okay, I feel really vulnerable. I think I feel as vulnerable as a 2-year-old. So actually, how can I now support myself in learning to do whatever I'm going to do?
Right.
Or in whatever area of my life. And to me, there's something about shifting that. And another key component in that is about being real.
Mm.
Because if we deny any form of critique, we're not actually supporting ourselves in growing.
Right.
So I think this sort of radical approach of what I would call radical positivity, I mean, I'm clearly very big on positivity, but a radical approach to positivity where we deny the fact that maybe we made a mistake means that we deny ourselves the opportunity to feel good about our learning curve. For me, there's something about really approaching that in a way that is healthy, because if you're not going to support, say, your son in continually speaking like a 2-year-old, he's going to evolve, and you will cherish every moment of that evolution.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think healthy self-esteem doesn't come from pretending that everything is perfect when it's not, but it doesn't come from being slaughtered either. It's about the real deal and loving it.
Yeah.
Really.
So I'm gonna talk about that in another way. So one of my big things is why. So I think we talk too much about what. Our question when we meet people for the first time is, well, what do you do? What do you do? As opposed to, why do you do what you do? And so for me, my underlying umbrella for wellness is, why do I do what I do? And the two pieces for me that fall underneath that, one is, well, what are my unique skills, talents, and contributions and gifts that I give to the world? What are those things while I'm here? And the second piece is, what are my lessons? And so why I do what I do is all based on those two pieces. And that is how I fit under being well and taking care of myself, is asking myself those two questions. And so for me too, when I think of mistakes, I think of them under those two pieces, right? So am I making a mistake because I don't know something, and this is one of my lessons?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's that healthiness and self-care in that for me. There's why is this happening, right? And then the other piece is, well, have I already learned this, but not quite. Is this new? Is this being introduced? Is this lesson newly being introduced to me, or is this a repeat lesson because I haven't quite figured it out, right? So there's a spectrum for me of how we can see those mistakes in our growth, as you say, right? So for me, it comes down to the why. And so how I take care of myself falls into those questions, which is everything that I do all day long.
What I love about those questions is that you automatically create an environment in which you listen to yourself. And actually, people very often do not slow down enough to listen to themselves. People who are struggling a little bit with self-care, maybe haven't even, going back to our very first question, haven't identified what self-care would mean to them. They are not in the habit of listening to themselves, prioritizing that. I love that you can frame that for yourself, because you've created a pathway through which you listen to yourself, and your listening allows you to reflect and to evaluate in a continual way. And also it values your very best contribution, rather than trying to channel you into something that maybe might not be such a good fit for you. Because I think a lot of the time as well, sometimes we do what we think we should be doing, rather than learning to listen to ourselves and thinking, right, okay, so if that's not working for me, it doesn't mean that it's bad. Maybe this is just not what is right for me. Maybe this is not my gift, my best contribution. How can I adjust that? Well, the only way we're going to learn about that is by listening to ourselves and discovering whether something is working out for us or not.
Right. Right.
I love that you can frame those questions in a way. What I hear immediately is you have developed a pathway of life that means you listen to yourself.
Yeah,
which I think
which of course
is
first starts with being able to ask yourself the question. Right? You have to ask
absolutely.
yourself the question
Yeah.
before you can listen. So this comes back to one of the other questions that we had talked about discussing, which is how do you know when you're practicing meaningful self-care? So what are the identifying maybe emotions or indicators that we're practicing meaningful self-care? What do you think about that?
I personally think I wouldn't identify a particular emotion as such, in as much as I think if something happens in your world that is quite challenging. I mean, let's say, for example, if you have a bereavement, for example,
Mhm.
you're not going to be feeling on top of the world.
Right.
Your emotions are going to be at the more negative end of the spectrum,
Yeah.
and so they should be. There'd be something
Right.
wrong with you if you weren't feeling that way. To my mind, if I am practicing a really good level of self-care, it means that I have a degree of resilience
Mhm.
and a degree of durability. It means that even if I'm feeling quite difficult emotions in the face of genuinely challenging, life circumstances, I'm okay about the fact that I don't feel okay.
Mhm.
I understand it, I recognize it. I'm not flawed or overwhelmed because I'm involved enough in whatever self-care I need. I'm responsive to the way that I'm feeling in response to the circumstances in my life, and that gives us a level of resilience and durability. So I think self-care is, if we were to have, I don't know, if we create let's say I make an imaginary line, and you could say if we had selfish at one end and selfless at the other end, neither of those are ideal places to be. We want to be somewhere in the middle, but we fluctuate along that line depending on what's going on in our lives. So if, say, I have suffered a close bereavement, I need by default to be at the more selfish end of the line, because I need to be investing more time in looking after me. If my life is really running smoothly, I can be at the more selfless end of the scale. I'm going to have more to give. And so it's recognizing where I am depending on my life circumstances, and the resilience comes in recognition, and in listening to myself, in asking myself the right questions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's two things that I want to pick up on. One is the idea that the resilience is cyclical. So if you have the resilience, a certain level of resilience, then you're able to sit with your feelings in a way that's non-judgmental. And then if you're able to sit with those feelings in a non-judgmental way, then you build resilience, right? And that all comes back to the self-esteem piece.
It
So
does
people
completely,
who are struggling
absolutely.
with that piece are going to have a really hard time sitting with those feelings without judgment.
Absolutely. I think we come back though then to building self-esteem. And I think one of the key areas here with self-esteem is firstly that we recognize if we have low self-esteem.
Yeah,
Really, really important, because that's a kind of starting point.
right.
And self-care, I think, is really, really crucial in terms of either what I would call repairing self-esteem, building self-esteem, and maintaining self-esteem. And there are very key skills that we can develop. And there's, many, many different things that we can do in order to address issues of low self-esteem. The very, very first point, I think, is just to even notice and become aware of it, and be prepared to say, do you know what, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to make a commitment to myself, to search out ways of actually beginning to address this, because you're absolutely right. I think people with low self-esteem often get involved in cyclical patterns that reinforce that. And really, I think that recognition is key to being able to take the first steps in addressing that. And self-care is a very important part of that.
Mm-hmm.
But you're quite right. I mean, it's a very cyclical thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Jenny, this has been an amazing conversation. Is there anything that you want to close with? Any lasting, last minute?
I don't know. I mean, I think if there is anything to close on, I would actually be asking people to, if they have listened to our conversation, and it's been a brilliant conversation, thank you too. if you recognize you have any issues of self-esteem, then reach out. There are lots of things. Both Ellen and myself have a wealth of information, audios, written work available to support you, much of which is free of charge. You know, reach out, because there are many people out there who wish to support you. We are two of them. So, you know, really just to make that invitation to people, if they recognize they have low self-esteem, if they're struggling with self-care, there is so much that you can do and so much help you can access. So don't feel alone.
That's wonderful. Yes, thank you. Thank you. And of course, I second that. And, you know, this conversation will be archived in a number of different places, so people will have the opportunity to view it at their leisure, when, you know, when, as often as they need to hear this, right? And I so appreciate your wisdom, Jenny, and your time to have this conversation with me today. So thank you so much.
You're really welcome, and thank you for your shared wisdom too. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Okay, we'll talk soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.